Hello and welcome to Square Eyes. Today we're looking at episode 3 of Ted Lasso, called Trent Crimm, the Independent. I'll be recapping the main points from the episode, giving you a few of my thoughts, picking out my favourite line, looking into any interesting bits and pieces that came up, and then looking ahead at what might be coming up in future episodes. Let's jump straight in. The episode starts with Rebecca excitedly leafing through the morning paper. If you remember the events from the last episode, you know this is because she arranged for compromising pictures of Ted and Keeley to be leaked to the press. Her excitement quickly turns to rage when she realises the story has not been published. Then, after the credits, we see Beard and Lasso talking tactics in their office, lamenting their lack of ideas after their defeat to Crystal Palace in their last game. Nate, as he's changing the bin, mentions that he has an idea, and after some convincing, shares his scrap of paper with his tactical plan that might help the team, and Ted takes his idea on board, much to Nate's great surprise. On the way out of training, Ted bumps into Keeley in the corridor, and she explains that she has found out about the picture of her and Ted that was going to be published in the papers that day. She had used her contacts in the press to delay the publication, but the pictures are likely to make it into the papers soon, and that will inevitably lead to drama between Ted and his star player, Keeley's boyfriend Jamie Tart. Because they don't know that the pictures were actually organised by Rebecca and Higgins in the first place, Ted and Keeley actually go to them for help to keep them out of the press. Unexpectedly, Rebecca agrees to help out the pair and to use her connections to keep the story out of the papers. Though we find out after Ted and Keeley leave that Higgins hasn't covered his tracks very well, so suppressing the story may be necessary to stop Ted and Keeley discovering who really commissioned the story. On the training pitch, we see that Nate's plan to use Jamie Tart as a decoy is bearing fruit, but it's not popular with the team's star striker, who feels it's a waste of his talents. In the changing room, we see a few players picking on Nate, which Roy Kent doesn't like, so he goes to Coach Lasso in the hope that he'll step in and deal with it. Instead, Ted doesn't do anything at all. He takes an oddly passive approach, but we then find out that he's doing it on purpose to try and get Kent to take matters into his own hands and take on leadership responsibilities himself. Kent immediately responds and confronts Jamie about how he encourages the other members of the team to treat Nate badly. Initially, Jamie responds with a belligerent attitude, but Roy persists until Jamie agrees to lay off Nate. He seems genuinely like he's going to change, but he immediately goes over to the players that had been picking on Nate and tells them to keep it up because he makes him laugh. This is similar to the last episode, where Jamie apologised to Ted after he put chewing gum in the collection box for Sam's birthday, but immediately showed this wasn't a genuine show of remorse by making a rude hand gesture behind his back as Ted walked away. Jamie is someone who is happy to lie to someone's face if his bad behaviour is called out. To Ted's delight, Rebecca has managed to keep the pictures of Ted and Keeley out of the Sun, but only on the condition that Ted would allow Trent Crimm of the Sun's sister newspaper, The Independent, write an in-depth article about him. Crimm has a reputation of being a tough journalist, but Ted feels confident that he can win him over. Then we get to the meat of the episode, which is Trent Crimm following Ted around to research his article. Crimm's cynical journalist is a natural foil for Lasso's relentless positivity, and it's a real treat when they're both on screen together, seeing them bounce off each other. Crimm watches on as Ted teaches his team Nate's tactic of using Jamie as a decoy. We see that Jamie is getting increasingly annoyed as his talents are not being fully utilised in this system, but Roy Kent is clearly delighted by this development and revels in Jamie's displeasure. Crimm expresses surprise at Ted's willingness to trust his kitman's tactical ideas. We can see that Crimm is very sceptical about such a junior member of staff being given such a large amount of trust, but Ted doesn't care about letting Crimm in on such information and is happy to share his information even though it's obvious to us viewers that it could be used against him by the journalist. Back in the changing room, Nate is still getting picked on by some of the players, and Roy Kent realises that Jamie didn't follow through on his promise to get them to stop picking on him. Keeley goes to see Rebecca and gives her a gift of a cactus to thank her for keeping the pictures of her and Ted out of the press. She chooses that particular plant because it's strong and prickly, just like Rebecca. Then we get to see the two bond a little as they discuss the way women are treated by the press, and Rebecca unexpectedly opens up to Keeley, so much so that she shows her topless photos of her on a yacht in Mallorca. Keeley's face, when she's looking at the pictures, is hilarious. It would probably have been a bit pervious had been a guy making those comments, but it felt more wholesome had it been a woman complimenting another woman about her body. This scene shows the start of a relationship developing between Rebecca and Keeley, which will most likely be seen more of as the season develops. Next we see Ted taking Trent Crimm with him on a visit to a nearby school. It doesn't start well for Ted when the head teacher gets his name wrong, and one of the children calls him a rude word. Things improve when Roy Kent takes the kids out to the playground to play football with them, until Kent's niece, who attends the school, boots a ball into Lasso's face. At the end of the visit, there's a strange confrontation between Kent and Lasso, where we see that the book Ted gave Roy has got under his skin, as he's absorbing the ideas inside it and getting his head around it all. He's also struggling with the challenges of leadership and doing the right thing, and doesn't like the feeling that this is all throwing up. Next up is a scene where Ted takes Trent Crimm to an Indian restaurant, where the driver that took him from the airport in the pilot episode works as a waiter. What follows is a funny scene where both men struggle to cope with the spicy food that is served up in front of them, while Trent tries to haul Ted over the coals with some tough questions about his motivations to be the head coach of a top-tier football team. Despite the scene being played for laughs with both characters struggling to talk through their burning mouths, it's also a deadly serious scene. As Ted explains, he is genuine in his desire to coach Richmond AFC, and we also get a sense that Trent Crimm is a proper journalist who wants to do good work too. Then we see Roy reading his niece the ending of the book Ted gave him, and he's completely bought into the emotional message of the story, and he's furious that he's let Ted get inside his head. Then we hear Higgins narrating Trent Crimm's article about Ted. Despite Rebecca's hope that it will be a hatchet job, Crimm captures the complicated nature of Ted Lasso, how Ted is authentically himself, whether that's good or bad. While the article is being read out, we see Roy go to a nightclub and headbutt one of the players as a way of telling them to stop messing with Nate. In a strange way, this is an example of how Ted's own leadership style has helped to make Roy step up and become a reluctant leader himself. It's interesting that ultimately Ted has won Crimm over, and the article, though realistic about Ted's chances of success at Richmond, still can't help but give Lasso a favourable write-up and show that his intentions are honourable. Once again, Rebecca's attempts to undermine Ted and the club have been foiled. I really like this episode. Definitely my favourite of the season so far. I think it was improved by giving more screen time to both Keeley and Roy, who are both superb characters, while also just generally being a lot more of a character-driven episode. The central plot of having Trent Crimm sniffing around the club to write a story gives an excuse to spend a day at the football club, seeing what is going on and watching more of Ted getting settled in as head coach. Things are still a bit tricky for him, but he's starting to find his feet a little bit. Roy Kent until this point has been a background character, so it was good to flesh him out a bit more and get to see him push back a bit against Ted and his methods. Brett Goldstein does a great job of portraying a hard-man kind of a player, but one who has a conscience and a moral compass too. I like the way that the show played with our expectations this episode, as we've been set up for an explosive confrontation when the tabloids published the photos of Ted and Keeley, but instead it was a suppression of the photos that was used as a bargaining chip to get Trent Crimm inside the club, something that would have been strange and unnatural if the newspaper hadn't have had some kind of collateral to get him in at that level. Similarly, the deal Rebecca struck to keep the pictures out of the papers helped to bring her and Keeley closer together and sparked their friendship. I like the way that the writers had an obvious path to follow with the storyline, but instead took a different path and found more interesting, but also more subtle directions to take the story. I hope that there's more of this as the season develops. If I had any grumbles at all about this episode, it would just be, for a TV show about a football team, there really wasn't very much football at all. Apart from a few scenes on the training ground, most of the action was really off the pitch. While it's clear that's where the majority of the drama is going to take place in Ted Lasso, I would still like there to be the odd game to happen from time to time. This is only a minor quibble, though, in an otherwise excellent episode. My favourite line in this episode came from Ted when he said, "I'd hate to see you and Michelle Obama arm wrestle, but I wouldn't be able to take my eyes off it either." It's such an odd line, but it's perfectly delivered by Jason Sudeikis, and Hannah Waddingham's deadpan reaction is brilliant too. The world that Ted Lasso exists in uses the names of real-world newspapers like The Sun and The Independent, but in this world they are owned by the same single owner, and Rebecca says she knows him. This is slightly different to our world, as The Sun is owned by Rupert Murdoch's News International, whereas The Independent is owned by a combination of people, but the person with the largest stake is a Russian-British businessman called Yevgeny Lebedev. I guess they needed to use a tabloid newspaper like The Sun as a paper that was likely to publish a compromising pictures, and then they wanted to use Trent Crimm because he was already an established character, so they made the connection between the two papers for the sake of the story. Ted Lasso gives each player on the team a book to help each of them embrace their role within the team. The books whose title is visible in the scene are Sam, who receives Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. This is a story involving a central character who is plucked from the place he lives because of his special skills and forced to use those skills in an unfamiliar and sometimes hostile environment. This parallels with Sam's struggle to adapt to moving from Nigeria to play in England. Jamie receives The Beautiful and the Damned by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is a story about a New York socialite who struggles to cope with the burden of wealth and status. There's no huge hidden message here. Jamie's ego and his fame are getting in the way, and this book has been given to him to help him see that. Only he threw it straight in the bin, so it's not like that he will take this message on board. Roy Kent receives A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. As Trent Crimm puts it, a story about a young girl's struggles with the burden of leadership. This isn't just mind games from Ted, but a genuine attempt to nudge Roy towards taking his role as the natural leader of the squad, and thankfully a role that he takes by the end of the episode, even if he assumes that role by violently assaulting a fellow teammate. This strategy that Ted uses of picking specific books for individual players was actually taken from the real world, as NBA coach Phil Jackson used to do this. In the middle part of the season, when he feared players would lose motivation, he would handpick books for each player that he felt would inspire them to keep going. Though Phil Jackson admits that many of the superstar basketball players responded to his recommendations in much the same way as Jamie Tartt. It's possible that the scene in the Indian restaurant where Trent Crimm and Ted are both eating incredibly spicy food while conducting an interview may have been a tribute to the YouTube channel Hot Ones, where celebrity guests are interviewed while they eat chicken wings that have been cooked in hot sauce. I think things were looking pretty bleak at the end of episode 2, and even though very little moved forward in this episode, it's starting to look a little bit better for Ted now. He's a bit more comfortable in his role as head coach, he's more familiar with the people he's dealing with, and they're getting to know him a little bit better too. Bit by bit you can see what he wants to do at Richmond AFC. When Crimm was interviewing him, he made the point that he doesn't care about whether his team wins or loses, which may be foolhardy in such a cutthroat profession, but it's also refreshing in a way too. He's instead concentrating more on the individuals he's working with and trying to help them achieve their potential, and that's how he's measuring his success. We saw Ted achieve a minor victory this week in winning over Trent Crimm and getting some good publicity for him and the club from the article. However, bigger challenges will be around the corner in upcoming games, and he'll need to start winning matches. Not to mention the fact that Rebecca and Higgins will no doubt have more dirty tricks up their sleeve and try and sabotage the club. On a more positive note, he does seem to be building a bond with his players, and both Nate and Roy are responding well to the encouragement in this episode. It'll be interesting to see what the next episode has in store. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in about a week to recap and review another Ted Lasso episode. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe and leave a like. Goodbye.